Welcome to Sherlock Shadow Channel, where every story hides a secret. Grab your coffee, sit back, and dive into a world of twists and turns. Tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city and country in the comments. Like, subscribe, and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let the adventure begin. Hercule Poirot and the Curse of the Wedding Dress. Chapter 1. The Cry in the Storm. The rain fell heavily on the turrets of the Hotel Valcourt, a stately retreat on the Normandy coast reserved for the French aristocracy and Englishmen with double surnames and deep pockets. The sea roiled beyond the drawing-room window, and a clap of thunder rattled the crystal glasses on the tea table. Despite the weather, the atmosphere inside was strangely still, as if the entire building were holding its breath. In the center of the room, Madame Darcy de La Rochelle, a matriarch of noble lineage and theatrical spirit, raised a cup with jeweled fingers as she spoke softly to her daughter Marianne. Marianne, as delicate as an 18th-century portrait, listened with a frozen expression, her gaze fixed somewhere between the carpet and the abyss. She was the fiancée of young Armand de la Garde, heir to one of France's oldest winemaking families. The engagement had been announced 3 weeks earlier, and the wedding would take place that same week. Everything was perfect, too perfect, until someone screamed. The scream emanated from the upper floors, so high-pitched and piercing that it halted the murmur of conversation, the rustling of cutlery, and the faint piano music played by an English guest out of courtesy. Madame Darcy stood up immediately, with a gesture she'd learned over years of opera. It was Vivien's voice. Vivienne Morel, Marianne's cousin and designated lady-in-waiting, had insisted on staying in the hotel's West Tower, a wing some staff members whispered was cursed. No one took such comments seriously, at least not until that outcry. The guests rushed upstairs. Footsteps echoed through the velvet-lined corridors. The housekeeper, a stern-faced woman named Madame Celestine, held a lantern as she led the way. The door to Vivien's room was locked from the inside. It was Armand who knocked it open with a blow of his shoulder. Vivienne lay on the floor, unconscious, her face as white as sea foam. The wedding dress, the one Marianne had inherited from her grandmother, an antique piece, hand-embroidered with religious symbols and time-worn flowers, hung in the closet. But what chilled everyone's blood wasn't the sight of the unconscious young woman, but what lay on top of the dress. Written in red paint, clumsily brushed onto the white cloth, was a sentence. "A bride will die before the altar." The hotel doctor arrived immediately, diagnosing Vivienne with a nervous breakdown. "Nothing physical," he murmured uncertainly, but she saw something her mind couldn't bear. Marianne, stunned by the scene, didn't say a word. Armand tried to calm her, but she retreated mechanically to her room, taking the veil from her dress with her. The next day, it was announced, the wedding would be suspended. It was then that Madame Darcy, showing unexpected determination for a woman of her age, made a call from the lobby telephone. "Oui, Monsieur Poirot?" "Yes, something very strange has happened. There's no blood, no body. But there is. A threat. And in my family, when threats take shape, they always leave a body behind." And so an invitation was sent. Not to an ordinary guest, but to one with a symmetrical moustache, neat manners, and implacable logic. Monsieur Hercule Poirot. Poirot arrived at the Hotel Valcourt at noon the following day, wearing his trademark bowler hat and a suitcase as tidy as his thoughts. He was greeted by the butler, a man named Auguste, a man as rigid as the chandeliers in the hallway. "Monsieur Poirot," said Madame Darcy, approaching with theatrical gratitude. I beg your pardon for inviting you at such short notice, but I fear we are dealing with something more serious than mere mischief. Madame, there is no mischief when fear has taken up residence in a young woman's face. Poirot gave a small bow. May I see the dress in question? The dress had been stored by the staff in a side room, out of sight. As the tulle and aged silk unwrapped, Poirot approached it like a surgeon examining a wound. Curious, he murmured. The red paint. Not blood. No intention to fake it. The threat isn't meant to appear a crime, but a prophecy. What do you mean, monsieur? Asked Armand, who had entered at that moment, crossing his arms. I mean, this isn't just any warning. It's a message directed at the mind, not the body. Poirot looked at each person in the room with minute attention. His gaze fell on Marianne, whose pallor was as constant as her silence. And Mademoiselle Marianne? Did she receive any letter, a note, any prior indication? Nothing, said Madame Darcy. But I dare say she hasn't slept since last night. She says she heard footsteps outside her room, even though the hallway was empty. Ah, Poirot murmured. Fear, once sown, grows in darkness like ivy on ancient walls. He turned to Auguste. I want to see Miss Vivien's and her fiancé's rooms and speak to every guest in the hotel, and, of course, the staff. There's no crime without context, and there's no context without people. That evening, as the wind blew again and the rain pounded stubbornly against the windows, Poirot took a notebook out of his pocket. On the first page, he jotted down 3 names: Marianne Darcy, silent bride, pale as a secret; Vivienne Morel, bridesmaid, fainted by fear or by guilt; Armand de la Garde, perfect fiancé, too perfect. Below, he wrote a solitary sentence. The threat doesn't want to stop the wedding. It wants the wedding to happen, so it can destroy it. And as he closed his notebook, Poirot murmured, a curse. It's just an alibi for the past, but I will seek the logic at the heart of the drama. Chapter 2. The Secrets of the Maid of Honor. Hotel Valcourt, West Tower, the morning after the scream. Vivienne Morel's room was still untouched, like a frozen scene in a Gothic painting. The air was thick with damp, an echo of the sea seeping through the old masonry. Poirot crossed the threshold with gentle steps, letting his eyes scan every corner with the meticulous patience of a watchmaker. Behind him, Dr. Fabien bent over a cup of coffee, more as an excuse for not intervening than out of necessity. Miss Morel is still asleep, the doctor said softly. I gave her a mild dose of sedative. Her nervous system is in turmoil, but I found no signs of physical trauma, not even a fall. It's almost as if the scream emptied her from the inside out. Poirot nodded, gazing at the dressing table. On it were a series of perfume bottles, all in a row except one, which was facing the wall. With a careful gesture, Poirot turned it back out. A touch of neglect, or a token gesture. He then looked at the pillow, barely wrinkled, and the mirror, fogged with condensation, but with no recent fingerprints. Who found her first? Asked Poirot without turning around. The hotel staff, after the scream. Armand broke down the door. Madame Darcy was shouting something about the cursed dress, and Marianne. She didn't come up. She locked herself in her room. Oh, and the staff? Miss Vivian had given strict instructions that she was not to be disturbed under any circumstances. She dined alone in her room last night. She has barely spoken to anyone since arriving, or rather, avoided everyone. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Interesting for a lady in waiting. Tell me, Doctor, do you suspect a hysterical fit? A pre-existing emotional breakdown? Could be, but there's more to it. The doctor lowered his voice. I found a crumpled piece of paper under your pillow. It's not recent. It's written in pencil, almost illegible. But there's something about it that disturbed me. He took the paper out of his briefcase and unfolded it. The sheet, yellowed and badly folded, had only a single line. I tried. But there are some things that can't be buried in a dress. Poirot stared at the paper as if expecting it to reveal its authorship. Finally, he folded it and put it in his pocket. Thank you, Doctor. This is revealing, though not in the way one might expect. Please keep this observation between us. Too many ears attentive to the dramatic distort the truth. Later, in the breakfast room, Poirot sat in a corner, openly observing. Marianne had not yet left her room. Armand sat at a table with 2 empty chairs, stirring his coffee without tasting it. Madame Darcy crossed the room, greeting each guest with the manner of a stately hostess, but with barely concealed concern. Poirot summoned the butler, Auguste, and requested a private interview with each guest present at the hotel the night of the scream. Not as a police officer, but as an observer of details, as he defined himself with strategic humility. The first to sit with him was a middle-aged Englishwoman, Miss Emmeline Craddock, a frequent guest at the hotel and a self-proclaimed expert on sacred art. Poirot let her talk for a while. Oh, Monsieur Poirot, such an event at the Valcourt. Unheard of. Although I must confess, that West Tower has always given me the creeps. It has an energy, how shall I put it, residual, as if someone has been lamenting there for centuries. Do you know Miss Morel well? I barely saw her. A silent creature. Always so proper, but sometimes too proper. The kind of woman who keeps secrets not out of malice but out of weakness. Don't you think so? Poirot smiled slightly. And Marianne Darcy? How have you seen her these days? The lady paused. Like a flower withered. I couldn't tell if she was happy about the wedding or trapped by it. The next interview was with Armand. The young man walked in with a determined stride but a tense jaw. His eyes weren't searching for Poirot, but for an invisible clock on the wall. Time seemed to weigh on him. Are you here to look for ghosts, Monsieur Poirot? No, sir. Just facts. Could you tell me what Marianne and Vivienne's relationship was like? Before or after the wedding announcement? Both, if you please. Armand hesitated. As children they were inseparable, but when they grew up. Vivienne couldn't stand being in the background. She was charming, yes, but jealous. And Marianne. She was never confrontational. I think she gave her space to avoid conflict. And you? What do you feel for Vivienne? Respect, but nothing more. I chose Marianne. There was never any doubt about it. Poirot made a small note in his notebook. Then he looked up. And last night? Did you see her after dinner? Just a moment. I saw her come up the stairs with something wrapped in white cloth. Maybe it was a shawl. I don't know. I didn't stop. And anyone else? I saw Celestine, the housekeeper, wandering near the back stairs, as if she were looking for something, though she was pretending to arrange the vases. Very dedicated to her work, that woman. Or very curious. Poirot then went up to the west wing corridor. He knocked softly on Marianne's door. A maid opened it. Miss Darcy does not wish to see anyone, he said firmly. Poirot left a card. Tell him I'm not just anyone. I'm someone who isn't afraid to see what others prefer to ignore. In his room, alone, Poirot spread the wedding dress on a chair. He studied the red letters as if they were Egyptian symbols awaiting translation. Then he placed the paper he had found under Vivienne's pillow next to it. There are things that cannot be buried with a dress, Poirot murmured to himself, as if speaking to the shadows. What was it that they tried to bury, and who dug it up? Because now there's not just a cursed dress, there's a promise. And promises, when broken, always come with a price. Chapter 3. The Alibi of Memory. The rain had finally stopped, but the clouds still hung like a lead roof over the Hotel Valcourt. Poirot, always punctual, descended into the drawing room at 9 o'clock, impeccably dressed, as if the weather had no influence on his attire or his moustache. Marianne still hadn't appeared in public. Vivienne remained asleep, or pretended to be, and as the air filled with increasingly charged murmurs, Poirot requested a meeting with the housekeeper. Madame Celestine, a woman with straight shoulders and a gaze as disciplined as her hairdo, received him in her office, a room so austere that even the flowers seemed to be under strict instructions not to be disordered. Mademoiselle Morel, Poirot began, did you have any special requests since you arrived at the hotel? He only asked to be in the West Tower, and that no one enter his room under any circumstances, the woman replied curtly. Did you know her before? Not personally, but I did know her mother, Isabelle Morel, when I was young. She was Mademoiselle Marianne's grandmother's maid, a woman of character. Her daughter, Vivienne, was always more sensitive. Poirot raised an eyebrow. And do you know why he insisted so much on that room, so far away from the rest? I don't know. He just asked for that tower as if he already knew something about it. Although no one has stayed there in years, some say the place is marked. Marked how? A memory, Celestine said, lowering her voice. 20 years ago, a young maid took her life there just before a wedding. Which one? The wedding was cancelled. It was never known for sure who the fiancé was. The family kept it quiet. The story became a rumour. But there are those who say it was a member of La Garde. Poirot narrowed his eyes. And now, another wedding, another young woman fainting, and another room in the West Tower. Very interesting. Poirot returned to his room and found an envelope carefully placed on his desk. There was no stamp, no name, just shaky handwriting that read, "To Mr. Poirot, confidential." He opened it delicately. Inside, a short letter, "Mr. Poirot. I saw Vivienne standing in front of the mirror, crying. She didn't scream out of fear. She screamed because of what she saw, something that made her remember. I don't know what it was, but someone forced her to go back there. Someone new. A friend." Poirot read the note 3 times. The envelope had no smell or marks. The ink was ordinary. The handwriting seemed forced to be anonymous, lacking style. A deliberate attempt to conceal identity, but not entirely professional. The signature, "A friend," made no sense if it wasn't expected to be discovered eventually. Poirot thought of the women in the hotel. Emmeline Craddock, too talkative for anonymity. Marianne, too silent to write. Celestine, perhaps. But then he remembered someone he hadn't yet questioned. At 11, she summoned Juliette, Marianne's personal maid. A young woman with an oval face and a habitually guilty expression, as if she constantly feared she had broken something valuable. "Has Mademoiselle Marianne left her room today?" asked Poirot. "No, sir. He didn't want to eat. He's only drinking lemon water. He doesn't want to talk to anyone." "But you're her maid. Doesn't she even speak to you?" "Not since last night, when he asked me to burn something." "Burn?" Juliette looked down. "An envelope. I didn't want to look inside, but it smelled like very strong perfume. Not hers." "Did you burn it?" "Not quite. Some of the paper fell out of the fire. I picked it up later. But only this remained." She took a small, blackened piece of paper from her apron pocket. Poirot took it with gloves. It read, barely legible, as follows. I'm waiting for you. Always. I'll wait for you. Always. Thank you, Mademoiselle Juliette. You did well to keep this. Perhaps you saved more than just a piece of paper. At lunch, Marianne finally appeared. Pale, wearing a sober navy dress and no makeup, she sat at a side table, avoiding eye contact. Poirot, with his usual politeness, approached without asking permission. Mademoiselle, may I accompany you? He said softly. Marianne nodded wordlessly. Forgive me for being so frank. Did you burn a letter that wasn't yours? She was slow to respond. Then she looked up with a mixture of embarrassment and resignation. It was Vivian's. I found it under my pillow. I don't know how it got there. I read it. I didn't want to, but it said things that I didn't want anyone else to see. Like what? Not everything was clear, but it talked about a promise, about someone who didn't keep it, about a debt that's inherited and not paid, and it mentioned a dress. Poirot remained silent. Then, with extreme delicacy, Do you believe in curses, mademoiselle? I think words can be knives if they are sharpened enough. And Vivienne, did she have sharp words? I was afraid. Not of someone, of something. Something I didn't want to remember. That afternoon, Vivienne finally woke up. Poirot was the first to speak to her. He found her sitting up in bed, pale but lucid, her eyes fixed on the window as if something outside were calling her. Miss Morel, he said gently, do you remember what you saw? She slowly turned her head. Her lips barely moved. I saw myself. In the dress. But it wasn't me. It was her. Who? The one who died. Years ago. The maid. The one he loved in secret. The one who was betrayed. The dress was hers. It was never meant to be worn again. Marianne doesn't know. No one told her. But that dress was promised to another. And how do you know? Vivienne swallowed. A single tear fell down her cheek. Because my mother was her friend. And I read the letters, the ones she hid in the lining of her dress. Poirot stood still. The mystery was no longer whether there had been a crime. It was when the first one happened. Because some crimes don't occur in the present, but are resurrected from the past with a whisper. Chapter 4. The Mirror and the Hidden Letter. The wind had changed. It no longer battered furiously against the windows of the Hotel Valcourt, but its whispers still drifted through the corridors as if carrying old, broken promises. Poirot, standing in Vivienne Morel's room, gazed at his reflection in the oval mirror that hung opposite the bed. It wasn't a modern mirror. The glass was stained around the edges, and the wooden frame, ornamented with carvings of withered leaves, seemed to belong to another era. Vivienne looked at him silently from the bed, still wrapped in the blanket, her hands clasped as if trying to contain a trembling that was no longer physical, but deeper. Mademoiselle, said Poirot, turning to her, you spoke of letters hidden in the lining of your dress. Where are they now? Vivienne looked down. I read them months ago, when Marianne asked me to help her restore it. I thought it would be just a symbolic gesture. But when I examined the inside lining, I felt something loose. And there they were. 3 letters, yellowed, folded carefully. I hid them. I didn't say anything to her. I was afraid of what they meant. And now I know I shouldn't have kept quiet. That keeping a secret is like hiding poison in perfume. No one notices at first, but it ends up poisoning everything. Poirot nodded slowly. Where did you keep them? On the dresser, behind the top drawer. But they're not there. Someone took them. Poirot walked down to the lobby with a determined stride. On the way, he asked the receptionist for a complete list of all the staff who had had access to the West Tower in the past 3 days. Then, without wasting any time, he headed for the dressing room. The wedding dress still hung like a motionless spectre, its whiteness shadowed by the red menace that crossed the bust like a scar. Poirot studied it once more, this time not for what it said, but for what it might conceal. Wearing gloves, he began examining the seams of the inner lining. He soon noticed something, a small, irregular opening, as if made in a hurry. He carefully inserted his fingers and found something firm. A folded paper. He pulled it out. It wasn't yellowed like the others. It was new, but it was written in old handwriting. It had been put away recently, as if someone wanted to replace what was lost with a doctored replica. The letter said, "You said you would love me beyond the altar, but your altar had another name. I was the shadow of your promise, and when I knew the truth, I went to the sea, dressed in white, with my heart full of lead." There was no signature, but Poirot understood something vital. This letter wasn't meant to be read. It was meant to be found by someone, by Marianne, or perhaps by him. In the middle of the afternoon, Poirot met Marianne again in the greenhouse, a damp, silent space where orchids hung like repressed thoughts. She waited for him, wrapped in a woolen shawl, her skin translucent like wax. "I dreamed of her," he said before Poirot could speak. "Not Vivienne, someone else, a woman in the fog, her feet bare and her dress wet. She spoke to me without a mouth. She pointed out the sea. Sometimes dreams are just loose pieces of the soul trying to put together a puzzle," Poirot replied gently. "But in this case, there may be more to it." He showed her the letter he had found in her dress. Marianne paled even further. "I haven't seen it before. Is it authentic?" "I don't know yet, but I suspect it was written not by the betrayed woman, but by someone who wants you to feel betrayed." Marianne closed her eyes. "There's something I haven't told you, Monsieur Poirot. When I was a child, my grandmother told me about a maid who threw herself into the sea for an impossible love. She said that's why the dress should be kept, not worn, but I thought it was just a scary story. And who was that impossible love? She never said so, but she once whispered that the blood of the de la Garde was cursed, that the lineage brought death where there should have been promise." Poirot remained silent. Then he asked, "Have you confronted Armand about this?" "Number, I'm afraid to know the truth, and I'm afraid that he knows it too." Later, Poirot found Armand in the library, leafing through a volume without actually reading it. The young man looked at him with the tired expression of someone who has kept up too many appearances. "Monsieur Poirot? Anything new?" Poirot sat opposite him, between shelves that smelled of old leather and dormant ink. "Monsieur de la Garde, do you believe that the past can murder in the present?" "What question is that?" "A relevant one. Because someone here is using ancient sins as a weapon, as a warning, as punishment." Armand closed the book. "Don't look at me like I know something. All I know is that I want to marry Marianne, and this story of ghosts, letters and threats is only poisoning everything. Are you sure there's nothing you've left out? No family history, no ancient connection between your family and a betrayed maiden?" "My father..." Armand hesitated. "He had a reputation. He was charming but impulsive. My mother bore it with dignity. She died young. It was said he had an affair with a maid in this house when the hotel was still privately owned." Poirot straightened up. An adventure, and that maid disappeared. Some said he left, others that he drowned, but no one said much about it. It was hushed up. Poirot looked at him gravely. It wasn't silenced. It was covered up, like you cover a stain with perfume. But the perfume fades. And now someone is opening that bottle again. Later that night, Poirot returned to the mirror in Vivienne's room. He wiped it with a dry cloth, slowly examining his reflection. Something about the frame disturbed him. He turned it gently. There, tacked to the back, he found a folded sheet of paper. One more letter. This one was different, old, with the Darcy family seal still visible. To whoever finds it, if this dress is ever worn again, let it be known that it carries within its seams the weight of a broken heart. Don't seek justice, only peace. May the sea wash away what the earth refused to bury. Poirot closed his eyes. It was all there. The forgotten history, the reactivated symbol, the threat disguised as a prophecy. Only one thing remained: to know who had awakened the past, and why now. Chapter 5. The Ring on the Piano Cushion. Morning brought a grey, diffuse light, the kind of light that seemed not to belong entirely to the real world. The gardens of the Hotel Valcourt were still shrouded in a light mist, and the sea, barely visible beyond the trimmed hedges, murmured softly. Poirot, already dressed in one of his impeccable pearl-grey suits, was having breakfast alone, his coffee at exactly 42 degrees Celsius and his croissant split into two identical halves. No one else had come down yet. It was Auguste, the butler, who interrupted his silent contemplation of the toast. "Monsieur Poirot," he said in a low voice, bowing respectfully. "Something unusual has been found this morning." The staff were searching the music room and found an object beneath the cushion of the piano bench. "We think you should see it." Poirot calmly placed the napkin on the table and stood up. "So, Monsieur Auguste, let's listen to what the piano has to tell us." The music room was a solemn and elegant room, with dark wood panelling and a chandelier hanging like a crystal locket. The century-old Steinway grand piano rested under a green velvet blanket. Nearby, Madame Darcy waited with an expression that oscillated between disgust and suspicion. "I can't imagine how it got there," she said, as soon as she saw Poirot enter. "No one has touched the piano for days, except for that English guest who was playing melancholy ballads on the night of the scream. But he left yesterday." Poirot approached. Auguste had already removed the cushion from the bench, and on the velvet surface lay an antique ring. Small, rose gold, a woman's ring. A pale blue stone was set in the center. But the most important thing was the barely visible engraving inside, which Poirot read aloud in a calm voice. "To my heart forever, L." Madame Darcy frowned. "L?" Poirot didn't reply immediately. Instead, he took out a small handkerchief and picked up the ring with the same delicacy with which one handles a relic. "Do you recognize this ring, madam?" "I've never seen it. It doesn't belong to any woman in this house, not to Marianne, not to Vivienne. Too old, and unsuitable for a lady of high society." Poirot nodded. "But fitting, perhaps, for a maid, for a promise made in secret, for a commitment without witnesses." Madame Darcy straightened sternly. "Are you implying that someone in this family had—" "I'm not insinuating, I'm observing. And what I'm observing, madam, is that the past is beginning to leave its artifacts in ever more visible places. Someone wants us to remember, or to discover what no one ever wanted to remember." Poirot spent the rest of the morning consulting the hotel records with the reception manager. He was looking for something simple, a name, an initial, a former guest, a staff member with a past connected to the West Tower. But the records were patchy. During the war, many documents were lost, and before the hotel was a hotel, it had been a private residence. "Here," the receptionist said at last, pointing to a dark leather-bound book, "we have a list of the domestic staff from before the hotel opened. Some personal notes made by Madame Isabelle Darcy, Madame's mother." Poirot leafed through the book carefully until he stopped at a page where, next to several crossed-out entries, appeared a note. "Louise Marchand, family maid since 1909. Discreet, good sewing. She suddenly retired in 1928. And next to it, in another more recent ink, someone had added, "Dead on the coast. Her body was not claimed by any family." "Louise," Poirot murmured. "The letter L, the ring, the letter, the dress." And then, in an even lower voice, "Vivienne wasn't inventing. She was repeating. Because someone, perhaps unknowingly, unearthed Louise's soul when they took down that dress. And now, the shadow of her story threatens to complete what was left unfinished." As evening fell, Poirot asked to speak to Vivienne again. He found her feeling more refreshed, sitting in an armchair by the window, her legs covered by a blanket. "I need you to tell me precisely, mademoiselle, what exactly you discovered inside the dress." Vivienne nodded slowly. They weren't just letters. There was something else. A handkerchief embroidered with the initials LM and a dried flower. Lavender, I think. It still had a scent. They were sewn inside a small pouch, hidden between the layers of lace at the hem. "And what did you do with it?" "I put it away. I wanted to show it to Marianne. But then I didn't. I started to feel like there was something off about the dress, as if looking at it was also being looked at. I know it sounds absurd." "Non, mademoiselle. Sometimes objects retain pain more persistently than people." Poirot leaned slightly towards her. "And the handkerchief? Where is it now?" Vivienne shook her head. "It disappeared. After Marianne accidentally touched it, the day we took it to the tailor for fittings. I swear I didn't take it, but I know someone did." That evening, Poirot walked alone in the garden, the ring still wrapped in his handkerchief. He thought, not just about Louise, about what had been so precisely forgotten, a name that didn't appear in the stories told by Madame Darcy, a woman without a grave, without letters, without photographs, and without justice. The sea in the background hit the stones with a regular cadence, like a deep, ancestral breath. Poirot stopped as he saw a figure under the eaves of the stone pavilion. It was Marianne. She was alone, staring out at the sea. In her hands, she held something small. It glittered in the moonlight. A ring. Not the one Poirot had found, another one. When she noticed his presence, she slowly closed her hand. "I found it among my mother's things," he said without turning around. "I don't know why she hid it. I don't know what the story is. I just know that ever since I touched it, I can't sleep." Poirot approached very slowly. "Because some rings don't seal love. They seal secrets." Chapter 6. A Promise Engraved in Silk. The next morning, the Hotel Valcourt awoke to a restlessness that was no longer concealed by its refined customs. The guests spoke more quietly. Footsteps in the corridors were softer. Even the crockery seemed to clang less loudly. Something invisible had descended upon the house, like a mist that wouldn't dissipate. Poirot, for his part, was in the hotel's small sewing room, where the light entered in slanted beams through the white curtains. On the table lay the wedding dress, spread out, like a body awaiting autopsy. Beside her, sitting very upright, was Madame Celestine, wearing her glasses and stiffly crossing her fingers. "It was you who made the final adjustments to the dress, oui?" asked Poirot, still staring at the lace. "Yes, sir. On Miss Marianne's orders. I only reinforced the edges and fixed the back closure. Nothing else. I didn't alter the lining, if that's what you're implying." Poirot ran his fingertips along the inside seam of the hem. It was perfect, but not original. There was a different thread, barely perceptible to the eye, but noticeable to the touch, a finer, more modern thread. "Who had access to this room after you?" "No one, except perhaps Miss Vivian, one afternoon. I saw her come in unannounced, but I didn't want to upset her. I thought she came for some personal item." "And did you know Louise Marchand?" Celestine's expression hardened. "She was younger than me, discreet, quiet. It was said she had undue affections, but she never admitted it. One day she disappeared. They said she left. Others, that she threw herself into the sea. No one asked too many questions. She was just another maiden. Easy to forget." "But you didn't forget her." "No," she replied with a coldness that almost sounded guilty. "Because she was good with a needle, and because she embroidered something for herself shortly before she disappeared. A silk veil with tiny letters. She said it was her secret. She sewed it like someone sews a promise." Poirot asked to see all the items in the wedding trousseau. Marianne agreed without question, as if beginning to understand that she was no longer the owner of her own possessions, but rather shared them with something, or someone, that had once inhabited them. The box containing the veil was untouched. Lined with grey satin, it smelled of camphor and old lavender. Poirot slowly took out the veil. It was beautiful, simple, made of almost transparent gauze. At first glance there was nothing unusual about it, until he held it up to the light. There they were. Hand-embroidered letters, almost imperceptible, spun in white thread on white. An ancient technique called shadow writing. A confession hidden in beauty. Poirot read in a low voice, reverently, "I was betrothed without an altar. I was loved without a name. I was dead without mourning. Let my story cover the eyes of the next one so that she doesn't see what I saw." Silence. Madame Darcy, who had entered the room shortly before, leaned against the doorframe, mouth agape. "My God, that veil. I thought it was a gift from my mother. I never heard those words. Who did this?" Poirot turned the veil towards her, as if showing her a mirror. "Louise Marchand, her maid. The woman her mother silenced. The woman who died waiting for a name. But that was decades ago." "Time doesn't erase what isn't faced, madame. You yourself said the dress had a story too tragic to tell. But silence turns into a shadow, and the shadow into a threat." That afternoon, Poirot gathered Vivienne, Marianne, and Madame Darcy in the tea room. The atmosphere was tense, as if an invisible cord were holding them together, stretched to the limit. "Mesdames," Poirot began, "the time has come to understand that this is not a curse. It is an inheritance, but not one of land or jewels, but of unresolved emotions, of broken promises, of wounds that logic can still explain, but the soul has not yet forgiven." He turned to Vivienne. "You found the letters, perhaps by chance, perhaps by unconscious searching, but in reading them you were touched by a pain that wasn't yours, and by hiding it you allowed it to grow." Then to Marianne, "You felt the weight of the dress even before you knew its story. because sometimes the blood remembers what the mind forgets. You knew, somehow, that the dress wasn't yours, that it hid a story that rejected you, and finally to Madame Darcy. You, Madame, knew something, or at least suspected. You didn't ask your mother about Louise. You didn't investigate when she disappeared. Silence was your way of preserving order. But order without truth is only a refined form of blindness. Neither of them spoke. Only the ticking of the wall clock marked the passage of time. Finally, Vivian looked up. So, you think someone is faking this curse? A real person? Oui, someone who has used cards, symbols, lost objects and sinister phrases. Not to commit a crime, but to warn or take revenge. Who? Marianne asked. Poirot was silent for a moment. Then he said, I don't know for sure yet. But I do know this. The next move won't be a scare. It will be an irreversible act. And we must find the culprit before history decides to repeat itself. With true blood. That night, while everyone was asleep, a shadow crossed the East Wing corridor. He carried an envelope in his hand and slipped it under the door of Poirot's room. Inside, a single line written in shaky handwriting. She didn't throw herself. She was pushed, and whoever did it is still smiling among you. Chapter 7. The Face Behind the Veil. The morning began sunlessly, with a dull sky that seemed to have been painted with a worn brush. The sea, calmer than in previous days, murmured a low, steady rhythm as if telling a forgotten story in a language only a few could understand. Poirot, as usual, was already awake, dressed, tidy, and with the anonymous envelope on his desk. He had opened it slowly, with a mixture of foresight and caution. She didn't throw herself. She was pushed, and whoever did it still smiles between you. That line, as direct as a stab, didn't strike him as an attempt at drama. Not now. Not after everything that had been revealed. This time the message wasn't a warning, it was an accusation. Poirot placed the note next to the ring, the handkerchief with the initials LM and the embroidered veil. On his makeshift desk, these objects formed the skeleton of a crime without a body. But someone, somewhere in the hotel, knew with certainty that Louise Marchand's story was not a suicide. At mid-morning, Poirot requested a private audience with Madame Darcy. The matriarch received him in the library, sitting in her velvet armchair with the rigidity of someone who still refuses to give in to the inevitable. I've received a note, Poirot said bluntly, a direct accusation. Not an insinuation, but an assertion. Louise Marchand didn't take her own life. She was pushed by someone who, to this day, walks these corridors with impunity. Madame Darcy didn't respond immediately. She seemed more concerned with not spilling the tea in her saucer than with what she'd just heard. Finally, she sighed. I can't say I'm surprised. That story never really convinced me. But no one wanted to open an investigation. It was easier to say it was the sea. Everything we didn't understand, we left to the sea. Who had a motive to get rid of Louise? She was beautiful, cultured for her class. Her presence upset the balance. My mother suspected someone in the family had crossed a line, but she didn't name names. Then everything fell silent. What I do remember is that the night she disappeared, my mother argued with someone, a violent argument with shouting, but I never found out who. By the time I wanted to ask, it was too late. And did your mother leave any letters? A diary? A will that might contain something relevant? A trunk, sealed. I never opened it. It's in the attic of the south wing. I haven't had the courage to go through his things. Madame, said Poirot, rising, I think the time has come to do so. The attic was shrouded in dust and cobwebs like a corner abandoned by time. Auguste, the butler, accompanied Poirot with a lantern more, out of formality than utility. The trunk stood at the back, covered with an old blanket. It bore the Darcy family seal carved into the wood and had an antique lock that Auguste opened with a rusty key. Inside, letters, diaries, a fan, ivory combs, an embroidered mantilla, and, at the bottom, an envelope sealed with broken wax, marked with a single word, Louise. Poirot opened it. The letter was dated 1928. It was from Isabel Darcy. "I can't allow him to marry her, not because of class or prejudice, but because of what he's willing to do to prevent it. I saw it last night. He pushed her. He thought no one was looking. But I saw it. And I can't allow my daughter to grow up among men who kill out of shame. This house will be silent. But I won't forget." Poirot's heart beat with a painful precision. There were no names, there were no details. But now he knew the essential thing. The crime had indeed occurred. It had been witnessed, and it had been covered up by the matriarch with a silence that now cried out for justice. Back in the living room, Poirot looked around at those present with a different perspective. He had stopped looking for a curse. Now he was looking for a murderer, a real one, made of flesh, memory, and fear. Madame Darcy, pale, already knew the contents of the letter. Marianne, sitting with her hands clasped, watched Vivienne, who seemed more lucid, more alert than ever. Auguste waited in the doorway, stiff as a statue. Everyone in the room was a cog in an ancient machine that was finally beginning to rattle toward the truth. Poirot turned to Auguste. "You have served this house for over 30 years, haven't you?" "Yes, Monsieur Poirot." "And you surely remember Louise Marchand well. She was a maid, but also a friend of some important figures in this house." Auguste did not reply. "There's something that puzzles me," Poirot continued softly. "You knew about the trunk. You had the key. You kept the attic locked, but you never destroyed its contents. Why?" Auguste swallowed. His eyes, for the first time, flickered with discomfort. "Because it wasn't my place. I was just following orders." "Whose?" "From Madame Isabelle," he replied after a long silence. "She asked me not to talk. She said that if anyone asked, I should say that Louise had left of her own accord." "And did you see anything? That night?" "I heard shouts, hurried footsteps, a door, then silence. When I went upstairs, the hallway was empty. Only the breeze drifted in through the open window in the west wing." Poirot closed his eyes. "So, Monsieur Auguste, you didn't push her, but you protected for decades the one who did." "I had no choice." Poirot opened his eyes. His sharp gaze now shifted to Marianne. "Mademoiselle, do you know any member of your family whose name begins with L?" Marianne hesitated. "My uncle Laurent, my mother's younger brother. He died in a hunting accident when I was a child. I barely remember him." Poirot walked up to her and carefully placed the ring on her hand. "This ring bears your initial. It was hidden in the piano bench. Who, but someone with intimate access to the house and to history, would have kept it there, not to be discarded, but to be found?" Vivienne leaned forward. "Do you think it was him?" "I'm not sure yet," Poirot replied. "But someone wants us to think so. And that someone, I now know, is still here, watching, moving pieces, preparing the final act." That night, as the hall clock struck 12, a figure slipped into the corridor. He was wearing gloves and carrying a small wooden box. He entered the music room. He opened the piano. He deposited something between the ropes, and he closed it carefully, without making a single noise. Poirot, from the darkness, saw everything. Chapter 8. The music that didn't want to play. Dawn found the Hotel Valcourt immersed in a thick silence. It wasn't the gentle silence of a deep sleep, but a strange, restrained one, as if the building knew something had been placed on its heart during the night. Poirot was already awake, as always, but this time he didn't sit down to breakfast or tidy his moustache in front of the mirror. He went directly to the music room, his precise footsteps echoing on the cold marble. The room was dim, the curtains still closed. He approached the piano, the same Steinway that had so often been ignored as mere decoration. With a key he had taken from Auguste's pocket after midnight, he opened the lid of the instrument. There, among the ropes, carefully wrapped in a dark cloth, she found a small wooden box, no bigger than a jewelry box, carved with floral details with no visible lock. He placed it on the side table and opened it slowly. Inside lay a single, white silk ribbon coiled like a sleeping snake. Unrolling it, revealed what appeared to be an embroidered note, again in shadow writing. I didn't push her, but I saw who did, and they swore silence to me. This silence was paid for with fear, and I can't afford it anymore. Poirot carefully put the tape away and sat down on the piano bench. His fingers didn't touch the keys. Not yet. Instead, he closed his eyes as if listening to a secret melody the piano didn't dare play. An hour later, he gathered Madame Darcy, Marianne, Vivienne, and Auguste in the tea room. The tension was evident, as if everyone knew the time for speculation was over. Someone, Poirot began, entered the music room last night, not to hide an object, but to deliver one. An object containing a confession. Not a complete one, but enough to show that Louise Marchand's murder was neither an accidental tragedy nor a suicide. He took out the silk ribbon and placed it on the table. Whoever embroidered this knew the truth, and they also knew the house, its schedules, its keys. They're not a stranger to you. They're someone who's lived with this secret for years. And now, perhaps out of remorse, perhaps out of fear of what's about to be revealed, they've begun to leave traces. An anonymous confession? Vivienne interrupted. Another one? No, Poirot replied. This time it's not a threat, it's an act of liberation. He turned to Auguste, who no longer looked like the untouchable butler, but a man wrinkled by the years and silences. Monsieur, you saw something that night, or someone told you what they saw, and you've been carrying a burden ever since, isn't that right? Auguste did not reply. We now know that Louise was in a relationship with Laurent Darcy, and we know that her death was hushed up by Madame Isabelle, but the tape speaks of another figure, someone who didn't kill but remained silent, someone who still lives. Poirot's eyes shifted to Vivienne. She frowned. What are you saying? Poirot watched her for a few seconds in silence. Mademoiselle, you were the first to mention the tower. You asked for that room. You found the letters, but you never mentioned how you came by them, or why you read them without telling anyone, or why you embroidered the phrases about the veil and left them where Marianne could find them. Vivienne stood up. Are you implying that I was the one who relived all this? I'm not implying it. I'm stating it. You didn't kill Louise, but you knew. Your mother told you, because she knew too. The letters you found weren't the beginning. They were the reminder. You already knew the story before you arrived. Vivienne trembled, but she didn't back down. I wanted it to be known. I wanted someone to say it. No one else would. Marianne was getting married, dressed in a dead promise. And I was supposed to stay silent, like everyone else? But in your quest for justice, Poirot continued, without raising his voice, you became the director of a shadow play. The letters, the veil, the ring, the red paint, everything planned, everything dramatized, everything except the whole truth. Vivienne lowered her head. I didn't know who pushed her, I swear, just that she died waiting to be recognized. I just wanted her to be seen. Poirot nodded slowly. Then he turned to Marianne. Mademoiselle, how do you feel about your dress now? That it doesn't belong to me, he said without hesitation. That it was made for another love, another altar, and another end. Poirot stood up. He walked to the window. Outside, the sea rose in small, luminous crests. The mystery, mesdames, isn't over, because the one who pushed Louise hasn't spoken yet. But now, thanks to the shadows Vivienne lit, she can no longer hide. He turned on his heels. Because last night, the culprit also saw that box being placed inside the piano. I was there, and I saw the face of the man who shouldn't have been awake at that hour. Everyone looked at him, even Vivienne. But Poirot only said, tomorrow afternoon, I will summon everyone present to the great hall, and then, with the permission of the little grey cells, we will reveal what happened, and why, so many years later, it still burns beneath the seams of a dress. That night, the breeze blew strongly against the hotel windows again, and in Poirot's room, under the door, no letter appeared. Only silence, a silence that, in the end, was afraid. Chapter 9. The meeting in the great hall. The lobby clock struck 5 in the afternoon. A gong resounded from the dining room of the Hotel Valcourt, not to announce dinner, as was customary in that formal establishment, but to summon everyone. At that hour, everyone involved knew something was about to be revealed. This wasn't just any old soirée, nor a salon conversation, it was the threshold, and Poirot, like an infallible master of ceremonies, was ready to cross it. The Grand Salon, usually reserved for gala receptions and intimate concerts, had been arranged with chairs lined up in a semicircle facing the closed piano. In the center, a small round table with an untouched tea tray. Everything was arranged with the obsessive symmetry of the Belgian detective. Poirot stood waiting. Dressed in dark grey with a white handkerchief in his breast pocket, his figure seemed even more motionless than the furniture surrounding him. One by one, the familiar faces took their seats. Madame Darcy, rigid as a marble statue, holding her cane in her hands. Marianne, with a pale face and dry eyes from looking inside so much. Vivienne, visibly calmer, like someone who has confessed what she could have confessed. Auguste, the butler, whose tie was crooked for the first time in decades. And Célestine, the housekeeper, called in at the last minute, with the excuse of completing the picture. Poirot raised a hand, and the room fell silent. Mesdames, Messieurs, I thank you for your presence. This afternoon I will not gather clues, but voices, because what happened here cannot be explained solely by objects or fingerprints. The crime we seek lies not in blood, but in silence. And that silence, for years, has been shared by several of you. He turned his gaze to Vivienne. You lit the fuse. You found the letters, the hidden memories. And in your quest for justice, which I don't judge but I do point out, you cloaked the past in a veil of spectacle. Threats, symbols, and embroidered phrases. But, mademoiselle, that only recreated the pain. It didn't resolve it. Vivienne looked down. She didn't speak. Poirot took a step towards the piano. Last night I witnessed an act. A box was placed inside this instrument. Inside it, a message suggesting I had witnessed the crime, but the most interesting thing wasn't the contents, but the timing. Because whoever placed it didn't expect to be seen, but they were. He turned his head towards Auguste. "Monsieur, last night you walked here with a dark flashlight. You didn't see me watching you from the hall mirror. Why did you put that box there?" The butler paled. No one moved. "I didn't do it for me," he murmured finally. "I did it for her, for Isabelle Darcy. She told me so. She showed me what she wrote years after Louise's death. She asked me that, if the past ever returned, I would protect the family name. And you protected him with a false confession? It was the only way to divert attention from who was really there that night." Poirot nodded gravely. "Thank you, sir. You've just confirmed to me that the person who pushed Louise wasn't her brother, Laurent Darcy, as many believed. Nor was it someone else. It was someone closer to you, someone who still smiles among you." The tension was now unbearable. Poirot left his place in the middle of the room and approached Celestine, the housekeeper. She looked at him with her characteristic coldness, but her hands trembled slightly in her lap. "You served this house since your youth, right?" "Yes, sir." "And you were the one who embroidered many of Marianne's trousseau items, including, probably, her veil. Isn't that right?" "That's how it is." "And did you also embroider the shadow writing we found?" Celestine did not respond. Poirot leaned slightly towards her. "You didn't push her. You didn't kill her. But you saw her fall. From the back stairs, as she walked back to the west wing. She didn't scream. You didn't intervene. And when Madame Isabelle asked you to be quiet, you agreed, in exchange for loyalty or fear. Am I right?" A deafening silence filled the room. Finally, Celestine spoke, her voice like a trickle of stagnant water. "I saw Laurent argue with her. But it wasn't him who pushed her. It was someone else, a female figure. I didn't fully understand it at the time. I thought it was a shadow. But when I saw that silhouette again years later, I knew it was you, Madame." Everyone turned to Madame Darcy. She didn't move. I don't remember," he finally said, barely audible. "That night, my mother argued with me. She yelled at me for something I'd said to Louise. She accused me of jealousy. I went to the tower to confront her. I didn't push her. I swear. We argued. She tripped. It was an accident." "And yet you let everyone believe it was a suicide," Poirot countered. "Not out of malice, but out of fear of scandal. And in doing so, you allowed a young woman to die without a name, without mourning, without justice." Marianne stood up, trembling. "You knew all this, Mother." Madame Darcy squeezed her eyes shut. "Not until it was too late. And then, how could I tell you? It was your wedding, your lineage, the weight of this house." Poirot intervened gently. "And that weight is precisely what Louise tried to convey, embroidering her story on the veil, sewing her truth into the folds. And now, at last, she has been heard. No one was arrested. There were no handcuffs, no screams. Just a wound finally closed with words." Madame Darcy agreed to deliver a signed and dated letter to the local gendarmerie, declaring the accident and its cover-up. Marianne cancelled the wedding. Vivienne checked out of the hotel the next day. Auguste requested early retirement. Celestine, in a final act of redemption, embroidered a new veil. No letters, just silence. Poirot, on his last afternoon in Valcourt, sat facing the sea, with his hat on his knees. "Some curses don't come from beyond, Hastings," he said softly, even though his friend wasn't there. "They come from the past, when it refuses to sleep." Chapter 10. Louise Marchand's Last Commission. The fog settled again over the cliffs of the Hotel Valcourt, this time with a gentleness that no longer seemed threatening, but mournful. as if the sea, finally aware of the truth that had been secretly entrusted to it, now maintained a complicit silence. The truth, although without formal punishment, had come to light. And with it, the face of Louise Marchand, invisible for decades, emerged from the depths of history. Poirot hadn't yet left the hotel. His suitcase was packed but not closed. The train that would take him back to Paris wouldn't leave until the afternoon, and he had requested one last visit. The sewing room. Celestine, pale but serene, greeted him with a nod. A new veil had been placed on the table, without embroidery, without symbols, just white silk, untouched, like an unwritten page. "This one's for the next bride of this house," he said, "if there ever is one." Poirot nodded, his eyes falling on a small open box in the corner of the living room. Inside, a forgotten piece of furniture slept. "Is that what I think it is?" "Yes, sir. I found it among the things we kept from Madame Isabelle. An unfinished order from Louise, a scrap of lace with sewing notes, and an envelope. Unopened." Poirot approached and took it between his fingers. The yellowed paper barely crackled. On the envelope, written in old ink and slanted handwriting, was the following: "For whoever discovers my story." Without drama, without ceremony, Poirot opened the envelope. Inside, a single sheet, brief but full of voice. "My name is Louise Marchand. I loved without being publicly loved. I waited without promise. I died without a name. I ask for no punishment, no scandal. Only one thing. May it not be repeated. May lies not be clothed in white. May the next bride of this house walk down the aisle without a shadow behind her. If this message is read, then someone has searched, and that's enough. I can rest now." Poirot read it silently. Then, with a gentle gesture, he replaced the letter in its envelope. He placed it over the new veil and covered it with a clean cloth. Mademoiselle Marchand demanded justice with silence. "Not everyone achieves it," she said quietly. Hours later, the train departed from the local station, crossing the humid valleys of Normandy. Poirot travelled alone in his compartment, his face pressed against the steamed-up window, his thoughts swirling like ashes in an already extinguished fireplace. He carried with him a copy of the declaration signed by Madame Darcy and a small handwritten note from Marianne, who had returned to Paris with her father a few days earlier. It read simply, "Thank you for giving him back his name. I'll use it wisely, so as not to repeat what others have left unsaid." Poirot folded the note carefully and tucked it into the pages of his leather notebook. That's where he wrote down his most personal enigmas, the ones that didn't appear in any newspaper, the ones that spoke not of crimes, but of souls. A week later, in the coastal cemetery, where only the wind spoke among the cypresses, a new name was engraved in stone. Louise Marchand, 1899 to 1928. Sight at last. There was no ceremony, just a gardener and a white cross, but someone, no one knew who, left a lavender flower tied with silk ribbon. The same kind of ribbon Louise had used to embroider her story. In his apartment on the Rue des Capucines, Poirot was organizing his desk when one last letter arrived in the mail. There was no return address, just the stamp from a provincial tailor's shop. Inside, a hand-drawn illustration of a wedding dress. Modern, elegant, without the old-fashioned lace. And in the corner, 2 words, "No shadows." Poirot smiled. Then he turned to his mirror and smoothed his moustache with precision. "And so," he murmured, "the little grey cells have fulfilled their duty to a lady no one wanted to see, and a story that didn't want to be repeated." Chapter 11. the echo that returned with the tide. 3 days after Poirot's return to Paris, a sealed letter arrived at his residence on the Rue des Capucines. It was neither official nor ceremonial. The envelope was a dull ivory shade with no return address and was handwritten in blue ink. The postmark read Côte d'Albâtre, the same coastal region where the Hotel Valcourt stood. Poirot opened it with a mixture of interest and foresight. Inside, a neatly folded sheet of paper. "Mr. Poirot, forgive me for writing again. I swore I wouldn't." But something happened. The night after she left, someone broke into Louise's old room. They didn't force the door. They didn't steal anything. But the mirror, the same one that captured the fall, broke during the night. No one heard it break. It just woke up like that. And on the fallen glass, someone or something wrote in ash, "It was no accident. Do you think the past has not yet finished speaking?" With respect, Marianne Poirot closed the letter and remained silent. His fingers tapped the wood of his desk. Then he stood up and walked to the window, where the Parisian sky stretched out in its leaden hues, blurring the city in an elegant haze. "A resolved story is not always a closed story," he said to himself. The broken mirror, the word written in ash, a message left behind, unspoken and unwitnessed. If it was a trick, it was clever. If it was a desperate act, it was even more disturbing. And if it wasn't either of those, then there was something deeper, something that had not been told. The next day, Poirot took a train back. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't announce his visit. He arrived at the Hotel Valcourt at dusk, when the sea was beginning to darken like a page burned around the edges. Auguste received him without surprise, as if he had known deep down that the detective would return. "Miss Marianne is in the garden," he said in a low voice. "She hasn't wanted to come in since the mirror broke." Poirot nodded and headed towards the grove. He found Marianne sitting on an iron bench, surrounded by sea mist. The wind moved her hair gently, as if the air itself were afraid of disturbing her. "I knew it," she said without looking at him, "that you'd come back." Poirot sat down next to him. Things that end with noise usually stay buried, but those that end in silence often find ways back. She nodded slowly. "I haven't slept, not since I saw the mirror. Not because of the message, but because of the reflection. The reflection. I saw something before it broke, just for a second. It wasn't my face. It was a woman, standing right behind me. And she was wearing the same veil, the first one, the one with the embroidered letters." Poirot didn't reply immediately. He was studying her face. Not for hysteria, but for truth. And what he found wasn't weakness. It was genuine fear. "Do you believe in ghosts, mademoiselle?" "I believe in pain, in memories that aren't completely buried, in inherited guilt. Isn't that a kind of ghost?" Poirot nodded slowly. "And I think," he said, "that we haven't unearthed the whole story." That night, Poirot asked to see the West Tower again. Not the room where Vivian slept, but the previous one, Louise Marchand's original room, which had been locked for years. Celestine guided him there with a flashlight and a key ring of muffled bells. "We haven't touched anything since you left, just like you asked." She opened the door. The air was thick. Not musty, but still as if the room had breathed its last long ago. The walls, papered with floral motifs, were faded. The mirror, now broken, sat on a dusty dresser. Poirot approached and crouched down. On the ground, among the shards of glass, a word written in ash was still visible. It was no accident. He stood and scanned the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but something bothered him. Something on the wall behind the mirror. He gently rapped with his knuckles. A hollow sound, not stone, thin wood like a hidden door. He asked Celestine for a more powerful flashlight and a spatula. After a few minutes of precise work, he managed to loosen a wooden panel. He removed it. Behind it, a narrow cavity. Inside, a leather-bound journal, Louise Marchand. Poirot stood still. As if by touching him, he would disturb not only a story, but the peace of a long-forgotten soul. Back in her room that night, she read each page. She did so without haste, like someone listening to a voice that has been silenced for too long. The first entries spoke of embroidery, chores, walks in the garden. Then the narrative darkened. There were references to late-night conversations, clandestine encounters, arguments. But what stopped him was an entry dated 3 days before his death. She came today, not my wife, but her daughter. She spoke to me with a coldness I never expected. She told me that if I kept insisting, I would regret it. I didn't understand at first, but then I saw her on the stairs that night, and I knew she wouldn't let me go quietly. I know my story will end in silence. But if anyone looks for me, let them find this. Poirot closed the diary, his suspicions confirmed not by deduction, but by Louise's own voice. She hadn't been pushed by accident. It hadn't been a fall, and it hadn't just been out of shame. She had been warned, threatened, by someone who couldn't bear to see her claim something she believed was hers. The next morning, Poirot handed the diary to Marianne. He didn't tell her what to do with it. He just said, "It's your inheritance in part. You decide whether it should be read or buried alongside the name you helped restore." She held it as if she were holding a china box. "I will listen to her," he said. "I won't forget her." Poirot nodded, and that afternoon, finally, he left. But as the train pulled away from the coast, the Belgian detective learned that not all crimes warranted jail time. Some simply demanded that finally someone believe them. Chapter 12. Where the Seams End. The September sun fell slantingly over the back garden of the Hotel Valcourt. The coastal flowers bent in the breeze as if sharing a secret between wilted petals. Marianne sat at the greenhouse's wooden table, her newspaper open in front of her. The pages rustled as if resisting being read. Since Poirot left, the house had fallen into a different kind of silence. Not the usual silence of a secluded hotel, but one that felt expectant, as if something were still breathing behind the walls. The kind of silence that forms when the last words have yet to be spoken. Marianne had read the last few entries over and over again. Not just the one about the encounter with the daughter, but also the ones that came before it. There, in a short paragraph, barely concealed between reflections on embroidery and the dampness of the sea, Louise mentioned an object. "I hid it inside the lining seam, in the deepest fold, where they'd never look, because they don't know how to sew like they used to. An object without a name, without context, but described with the urgency of someone who knows that everything may depend on its discovery." Marianne stood up abruptly. She didn't go to Louise's room, but to the basement in the west wing. There, still hanging on a rusty hanger, was the grey coat Louise wore during the cold months. No one dared throw it away, as if containing the fabric meant containing a part of her. She took it down. She carried it to the greenhouse. She took a pair of embroidery scissors and, with tense hands, began to unstitch the lining from the inside. It took 10 minutes, maybe less. But in that time folded back on itself. From inside emerged a small, worn red velvet bag embroidered with the initials MD. Inside, carefully wrapped, was a pendant. It wasn't valuable. Antiqued brass with a dull stone. but on its back, a tiny inscription. To my daughter, for what blood is silent about. Marianne held it in her palm, as if it were a silent revelation. To my daughter, for what the blood is silent about. There was no doubt. It wasn't a memento. It was a confession in the form of a jewel, a symbol, something Louise had left behind so that one day, what could never be spoken would be said. She knew then that she had to speak to the only person who could finally piece together the truth. Not Poirot, not Auguste, Vivienne. Finding her wasn't difficult. Although she had almost completely withdrawn since the incident with the mirror, she maintained a routine of evening walks along the northern cliff. Marianne went there, holding the pendant and hiding the diary in her bag. Vivienne was dressed in black, as always, but with a blue scarf that the wind kept trying to tear off her. When she saw Marianne approaching, she stood still, neither hostile nor friendly, just still. "Have you come to tell me something?" he asked, his voice flat. Marianne held out the jewel. "I found it in Louise's coat, with her diary." Vivienne didn't take it, she just looked at it. Her lips tightened. "So you finally talked to him, the Belgian." "I didn't have to tell him everything, just enough to hear what no one else wanted to hear." Vivienne turned toward the sea. The wind ruffled her hair, revealing her age beneath the faint paint on her face. Louise wanted to tell the world. She thought the world owed her something, she murmured. She didn't understand that sometimes silence is also an act of love. Marianne took a step closer. Love? Is it love to condemn someone to eternal silence? To shame? To die without their story being known? And what would have happened if it got out? Vivienne turned to her, her eyes icy. That Mama would have recognized her? That you would have been raised in this hotel as a shameful inheritance? That the press would have destroyed the family? "That's happened before," Marianne whispered. "But without the truth, without justice. Just one woman who fell down a ladder, and another who keeps pretending she didn't see anything." A silence strained the air between them. Vivienne looked down at the pendant. "It was my mother's," he finally said, his voice low. "She lost it before she died. Louise found it. She showed it to me one day. I saw it in her hands, and I understood. She didn't say it, but she didn't need to. I saw it in her eyes. She was the daughter of the same woman as me." Marianne closed her fist around the pendant. The stone felt warm now. "I don't want revenge. I don't want to destroy what remains. I just want Louise's name to be cleared, for her death not to be a forgotten fall, for her story to be told, even if it's in a hushed voice." Vivienne nodded slowly, once, and that was enough. "You'll get what you deserve," he said, what she deserved. That evening in the guest room, a lamp that hadn't been lit for years was lit. Marianne gathered Célestine, Auguste, even the few guests who remained during the off-season. She took out her diary. She read 3 passages. Not all of them. Just the ones that were missing. No one spoke at first. But when he finished, Auguste stood up. He went to the wall where the hotel's old photos hung. He took one from the lower shelf, one showing the staff in 1967, and, with trembling hands, placed it among the portraits on the first floor, where the founders and benefactors were displayed. Louise Marchand, in uniform and with a discreet smile, finally stood with those who never recognized her. That night, the sea roared louder than usual, but not furiously, with relief. Chapter 13. A letter that was never sent. The next morning dawned shrouded in a thick fog, as if the Hotel Valcourt itself were breathing a pent-up sigh. The window panes sweated silently, and the outside world seemed suspended, caught in a pause between what had been revealed and what remained in the shadows. Poirot returned early. His silhouette emerged through the mist like a figure carved in time. Marianne watched him cross the threshold with a determined stride, his cane tapping lightly on the marble of the hall. He didn't ask anything as he entered. He just looked at her, with that twinkle in his eyes he reserved for those moments when the pieces began to fall into place. "The house has started talking, hasn't it?" he said, placing his hat on the coat rack. Marianne nodded. Vivienne accepted the truth. Not publicly, but something broke, or opened. I don't know. Poirot watched her delicately. Sometimes you don't need to declare a crime out loud. You just have to allow silence to acknowledge it. They headed together to the blue drawing room, the same one where Louise knitted in the evenings, and where conversations always seemed to contain more than they said. Marianne handed him the pendant and the diary. Poirot examined them silently, running his fingers over the inscription as if reading not just words, but wounds. "The pendant is important," he said finally, "not for its value, but for its journey. It has passed from mother to daughter like a witness, not legal but moral. And now it has returned to your hands, Mademoiselle Marianne, like an echo demanding a response." Marianne swallowed. "But what else is left? I've said it. I've shown it. What's missing?" Poirot raised an eyebrow, and his expression crossed that familiar line between patience and anticipation. A story rarely dies with a revelation. Sometimes it survives in places we don't think to look. In the paper, no one opened. In the drawer, everyone thought was empty. At noon, Poirot requested access to the attic in the north wing. It was a neglected section of the hotel once, used to store blankets, antique ornaments, and albums no longer looked through. Auguste, still wary but aware of the weight of the previous night, handed over the key slowly. They climbed the narrow staircase, covered in dust and memories. As they opened the door, the air smelled of sealed wood and old secrets. Marianne turned on a portable lamp. The light cut through the darkness, revealing furniture covered in yellowed sheets, stacked trunks, and broken boxes. Poirot stopped beside an abandoned desk, an Art Deco model with mother-of-pearl details on the handles. He examined the edges, then felt the underside. He carefully pushed a small spring, and with a soft click, a hidden compartment opened. Inside, a letter, old, sealed with violet wax with no return address. The ink on the envelope is still legible. "To Monsieur Giraud, notary, only if I disappear." Marianne felt a knot in her stomach. "Do you recognize her?" asked Poirot. She shook her head slowly. "No, but the name sounds familiar. Giraud. He's a notary in Marseille, the one who handled Clarice Valcourt's will." Poirot opened the letter with gloves on. Inside, a sheet of paper written in firm but emotional handwriting. He read it silently. Marianne watched as his eyes lingered with increasing intensity, as if each line carried a new burden on his shoulders. Finally, he looked up. "It's from Louise," he said gently. "Dated 2 weeks before her death. It wasn't mailed. Maybe she tried. Maybe someone stopped her." "And what does it say?" Poirot handed her the letter. Marianne read it in a low voice, her throat tightening. "I've kept silent for years. But the illness is crushing me, and I can't trust my body to hold out any longer. Clarice Valcourt's daughter lives, and she has the right to know. I don't want her inheritance, I just want justice. An untold story is a wound that never heals." Below, an underlined sentence. If something happens to me, it wasn't an accident. Marianne brought her hand to her mouth. She knew. She was afraid that someone would silence her. Poirot nodded. She didn't fall out of weakness. Someone pushed her, and that someone had an interest in ensuring this letter never arrived. A silence spread like a curtain. That afternoon, Poirot retired to his room. Marianne went down alone, the letter in her hand. Celestine was waiting for her in the sewing room with her usual tea. He only needed to see Marianne's expression to understand that something had definitely gone wrong. Did you find what you were looking for? I have found what she left to be found. Celestine nodded, with a sad serenity. Then be careful, because when the trunk of the past is opened, the living tremble more than the dead. In his room, Poirot placed the letter next to the pendant, the diary, and a note he had written in impeccable handwriting. Then he looked out the window. The fog was beginning to dissipate. But the crime, he thought, wasn't just one of death. There was also a crime of silence, and that one, often, was harder to punish. Chapter 14. The hallway where no one tread. The silence of the east wing was different. It wasn't the silence of rest or reflection. It was a thick, sealed silence, as if the walls themselves refused to remember. It was the oldest part of the Hotel Valcourt, closed years after a renovation that was never completed. Auguste, as a rule, didn't allow access. He said the damp had won the battle against time there, that it wasn't safe, that there was no point in reviving dead rooms. But that morning Poirot asked to be led to that corridor. There is a story that has yet to be spoken, he said, and perhaps, Monsieur Auguste, what is not seen is what is most shouted. Marianne, Judith and Celestine accompanied him. Vivienne didn't leave her room. She had been sick the night before. According to Judith, she had vomited after breakfast. No one insisted on her presence. Her absence was, in a way, eloquent. Auguste, with trembling hands, opened the door to the closed wing. The hinge creaked, as if complaining about the return of the living. The air had a stagnant smell of wet cloth and stale perfume. Footsteps echoed on the ancient floorboards. The corridor stretched long and uneven, with crooked paintings and curtains hanging halfway down. Here, a broken lamp. There, a carpet rolled up like a sleeping body. Guests stayed here during the war, Auguste said, barely above a whisper. Displaced families, down-and-out artists, homeless poets. Clarisse and I helped out however we could. And then? Then, there was a fire in the back room. No one died, but it gave us an excuse to close it down. Clarisse always said that wing brought bad luck. She never set foot in it again. Poirot stopped in front of a door numbered 213. Who slept here? Auguste hesitated. A woman. I don't remember her name, but she had a red notebook. She wrote obsessively. She said someone was dictating the history of this place. I never knew if she was crazy or a prophet. Marianne stepped forward. She carefully opened the door. Inside, the room remained untouched. The furniture was covered with sheets that were no longer white. A lamp hung awkwardly, and on the nightstand, a notebook. Red. Poirot took it delicately. There was no name on the cover. When he opened it, the first pages were filled with notes, dates, names, phrases with no apparent connection. But then, something clearer, a story. She carries a mirror on her chest. It doesn't reflect, it doesn't illuminate. It absorbs. Every word spoken in this hotel belongs to her, every tear, every betrayal. Marianne felt a chill. Are you talking about Clarisse? Poirot leafed through more. They say your daughter is dead. But I hear laughter from the empty cradle. And that new servant. Doesn't she look too much like Clarisse was at 17? A silence fell. Judith murmured, "How would any guest know that?" Poirot closed the notebook. Because she wasn't just any guest. She was someone who knew the hidden lineage, someone who heard more than she should have. Auguste pressed his lips together. "I never saw that notebook. I swear." Poirot didn't reply. He went to the window. The glass was broken in the lower corner. Through it, the back garden could be seen, and just below, what looked like a trapdoor. "What's there?" "A cellar. We used to store wine there, but not anymore. It's been sealed for decades," Auguste said. Poirot nodded without turning around. "In that case, sir, we'll have to unseal it." Hours later, under the dull afternoon sun, Auguste forced the trapdoor. An ancient creak emerged from the hinges. A damp, earthy smell wafted from the gap like breath held for years. The staircase spiraled downwards. Judith took a step back. Marianne, on the other hand, moved forward fearlessly. Celestine followed her, followed by Poirot with a lantern. The basement was small, just a rectangular vault with stone walls. There were empty shelves and a rusty table, but in one corner there was what looked like a chest. Poirot knelt and forced the lock. Inside, wrapped in thick cloth, were several pieces of sheet music, all signed Clarisse Valcourt, but underneath a smaller box made of blue velvet. He opened it, inside a sealed envelope, with the name of Marianne handwritten. Marianne covered her mouth. Her eyes trembled. "It's her handwriting," he said. "It's Clarisse's." Poirot handed her the envelope without saying anything. Marianne held it as if she feared it would crumble to dust. Beside her, Judith took a deep breath. "What's in it?" Marianne looked up. Her eyes were no longer filled with doubt, but with something older, as if a silent inheritance had finally reclaimed its voice. The truth, or the latest version of it. When they surfaced, the fog had disappeared. The sky was clear for the first time in days, but what had been unearthed would not dissolve in the light, because a name had spoken again, and a past, finally, demanded an answer. Chapter 15. The Truth Within the Pentagram. Marianne locked herself in her room with the letter in her hands. She didn't want to open it in front of anyone, not even Judith. That night, she didn't eat dinner. She didn't speak. She just walked in circles, as if the room were too small for her agitation. Poirot, on the other hand, did not retire. He ordered tea in the lounge. He sat in front of the unlit fireplace and let the silence speak for him. Judith joined him in silence. Celestine, after a long sigh, announced she was leaving. Auguste did not emerge from his office. Vivienne did not appear either. The hotel, for the first time in days, seemed to hold its breath. Hours passed, and when the clock struck 10, Marianne's footsteps echoed on the stairs. She entered the room with the empty envelope in one hand and the unfolded letter in the other. Her face had changed. She was neither pale nor trembling. There was in her expression a kind of calm known only to someone who has just heard a truth feared for years. "I've read the letter," she said, sitting down opposite Poirot. "And I don't quite understand what it says, but I feel it wasn't written to explain anything to me. It was written like a confession that Clarisse needed to get out of her soul." Poirot inclined his head. "Read it, if you think it prudent. With each word, we approach the heart of this symphony." Marianne nodded. Her voice was low but firm. "My dear Marianne, if this letter ever reaches your hands, it is because I haven't had the courage to tell you so in life. I loved you with an intensity That silently destroyed me, because I loved you for who you were, and for what I shouldn't have told you you were. I raised you as a daughter, but I wasn't your mother. Not in the sense that word is understood. You were the fruit of a night that should never have happened. A man came to this hotel during the war. He was a composer, wounded, lost, but still with melodies in his blood. We played together for a week, and then he disappeared. He left no address, only a letter, and an untitled score. I could never destroy that music. I hid it, and when I found out I was pregnant, I decided no one should know, not even you. I invented a loss, a funeral without a body, to hide the life that was being born. Judith knew. She always knew. She knew by the color of your eyes, by the rhythm of your breathing, by the tears I didn't shed. But she was loyal to me. And to you, she gave more love than I ever knew how to give. Forgive me. Not for raising you, but for silencing you. Marianne fell silent after the last words. No one spoke for a long time. Poirot took a deep breath, like someone slowly untying a knot. It's a profound revelation, but it's not the whole story. Judith ran a hand over her face. Clarisse, you hid this for so many years, and you left us only this letter? Marianne looked at her. The letter has a postscript. It says, "Look where the melody ends." There I left what I didn't know how to burn. Poirot slowly straightened in his chair. An untitled score, an unfinished melody, a secret he refused to destroy. Mademoiselle, I believe that piece still rests somewhere in the hotel, and if I may suggest it, it won't be a simple sheet of paper. The search began at dawn. Celestine, now awake, helped sort through the shelves in the music room. Judith searched the drawers in Clarisse's office, and Marianne the old trunks in the attic. Poirot, however, didn't search with his hands. He searched with his mind. Where the melody ends, he repeated to himself. What did he mean? The last bar? The piano where he last played? Or maybe. He headed for the small living room, the one no one entered anymore. The one with the dusty harpsichord in the corner. Clarisse used to lock herself in there during the evenings. She said the light was better for composing. Poirot sat down in front of the instrument. He opened the lid. The keys were worn. Some were out of tune. But it wasn't the music that interested him. It was the lid of the harpsichord. He knocked softly, hollow. Poirot took out a small pocket knife and ran the blade along the edge. A splinter came loose. Inside, wrapped in black cloth, lay a roll of parchment, handwritten score, untitled. The ink has run slightly. In the lower margin, a phrase, "For the daughter who won't know she's mine. Let the music speak for me." Poirot led him into the living room where the others were waiting. "We've found the final piece." Judith unrolled it. Her eyes watered. "I've heard this before. Clarisse used to play it, when she thought no one was listening." Marianne closed her eyes. "Then we must listen to her, completely, for the first time." That evening, in the main hall, Marianne sat at the piano. Judith held the score with steady hands. Celestine lit all the lamps. Auguste remained at the door, and Vivienne, silent, appeared on the threshold unbidden. Marianne began to play. The first notes were soft, as if doubting themselves. Then they grew in melancholic spirals. There were echoes of an unfulfilled love, of an endless wait. The piece wasn't long, but each measure weighed like an unlived year. When the last note died in the air, no one applauded. Just silence, reverential, pained, understanding. Poirot finally spoke. "Now, Clarisse has said everything she had to say, and with that, she's freed more than one ghost from this place." But as everyone breathed lighter, Vivienne stepped forward. "That music," he murmured. "It's not just a goodbye. It's a memory. I heard it before Clarisse died." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And where, mademoiselle?" Vivienne looked down. In the porcelain gallery, the night of the fire, Clarisse was there, and someone else with her. Judith turned to her. "Who?" Vivienne looked at her. Her voice was a whisper. She wasn't a woman. Chapter 16. Shadows Under the Porcelain. The silence that followed Vivienne's revelation wasn't one of surprise, but of something thicker, like a mist slowly descending over the room. Marianne kept her hands on the keyboard, unmoving. Judith turned to Vivienne, her expression stern, though not aggressive, as if her mind, honed by years of restraint, needed time to accept the new cracks opening in the facade of memory. Poirot was the first to break the stillness. "Are you sure, mademoiselle? Did you hear that same melody in the porcelain gallery, the night of the fire?" Vivienne nodded, with a mixture of embarrassment and fear. "Yes. I had slipped away from the service. I was nervous that night. Something about the atmosphere bothered me. I decided to go through the back hallway and go out to the garden. As I passed by the gallery, I heard the piano. It wasn't a record or a recording. Someone was playing it live. I approached the door, and I heard Clarisse's voice. She was arguing with someone, a male voice. He sounded upset. "Could you make out any words?" asked Poirot. Vivienne pressed her lips together. "Not many, but I remember one phrase clearly. He said, 'You can't keep it. It's as much mine as it is yours.' And she replied, 'It's not yours anymore. It never was.'" Judith and Marianne exchanged glances. The allusion was impossible to misinterpret. And yet, the confusion remained. "How long were you listening?" Poirot persisted. "Maybe a minute. Then something fell to the floor. A vase, I think. And then the music stopped abruptly. I got scared and ran outside. I didn't see anyone's face. But hours later, you know, the gallery was burning. Clarisse was dead." Poirot placed a hand on his moustache with a slow, measured gesture. An argument over a daughter, hidden music, a sudden fire, and now the confirmation of a male voice. Voila. A new piece is added to the puzzle. Judith finally spoke. "Clarisse never spoke of any man. Not that night, not before. What if he was the one who killed her? Out of spite, out of fear?" "Or for the same reason one burns a letter before it's read," Poirot said gently, "to silence the truth." The next morning, Poirot asked Celestine for full access to the porcelain gallery. Although it had been restored after the fire, some display cases were still empty. The air still held a faint smell of varnish and ash. Poirot, Marianne, Judith, and Vivienne entered together. Auguste watched them from the doorway, without saying a word. "Vivienne," said Poirot delicately, "show us the exact spot where you stopped that night." The young woman pointed to the left side of the door, where the moulding barely protruded from the wall. "I hid there. I could see the light under the door, and hear clearly." Poirot inspected the frame. He ran his fingers over the surface and then bent down, gently tapping at the base of the wall. Something hollow responded. Curious. He took a small tool from his pocket and extracted a loose tablet. Behind it, wrapped in waxed paper, was a yellowish envelope, taped shut. Judith took a step forward. "Another letter?" Poirot opened it. It wasn't a letter. It was 3 old black-and-white photographs. Marianne as a child, Clarisse, and beside her a man, tall, with messy hair and intense eyes. There were ink or paint stains on his fingers. He smiled somewhat sadly. On the back of one of the photos, it was handwritten, Julien, 1943, Adagio Hotel. Judith paled. Julien. He was a musician. He came during the war. He played with Clarisse on several nights. I was little. I remember that they admired him, but they didn't talk much about him. He disappeared suddenly. And yet, said Poirot, it left a lasting impression. Did you know it's still listed in the hotel register? Just one stay, spring of 43. Then never again. And isn't it interesting that the surname is crossed out in the file as if someone had tried to erase it? Vivienne whispered, Do you think he's back? Poirot narrowed his eyes. That's what we need to find out now. But there's something else. He went to the corner where the fire had started, according to the report. A display case frame had dark marks on the bottom, as if it had contained an electrical device. What if the fire wasn't accidental? What if it was set to destroy evidence? Poirot turned to the women. This isn't just a case of family secrets. It's a crime hidden among sheet music and china, and perhaps it hasn't even finished happening yet. That evening, Poirot wrote a letter and asked Auguste to send it by express courier to Paris. He didn't specify who it was addressed to, but he wrote a name in bold letters next to the return address. Commissioner Durand, Military Archives of Disappeared Composers, 1940 to 45. Marianne, seeing him from the stairs, asked, Are you looking for Julien? Poirot nodded. Or what's left of it, whether it's a grave or a still living presence. Marianne went down one more step. What if he didn't come for revenge? What if he came for me? Poirot didn't reply. He just stared at the candle flame, as if he could read a melody not yet written in it. Chapter 17. The Man Who Played from the Shadows. The next morning arrived with a thick mist drifting across the rooftops of Montfaucon like a grey veil over an unspoken secret. The windows of the Hôtel des Lys trembled with the cold breath of the wind, and the corridors seemed narrower, as if the entire building were holding its breath. Poirot, now impeccably dressed, was waiting in the hall. On the table in front of him, a teapot was steaming, untouched. His eyes were fixed on the front door, though he didn't seem to be waiting for it, but for something much older, more intangible. The echo of a name, perhaps, or of a long-delayed reunion. It was Auguste who approached, holding an envelope with the stamp of the Paris Gendarmerie. Monsieur Poirot, he's just arrived by messenger. Urgent. Poirot took it without a word. He opened it with a single stroke of his small, silver knife. He read it silently, while Auguste discreetly stepped back, his expression filled with something that wasn't surprise, but recognition. Judith appeared a few minutes later, followed by Marianne and Vivienne. Neither of them had slept well. It showed on their faces, in the silences between sentences. Have they heard back from Paris? Judith asked, cautiously crossing her arms. Poirot nodded, looking up from the document. Julien Rousseau, composer. Registered in 1943 as an artistic collaborator during the occupation, although nothing was ever proven. Disappeared months later, without a trace. Declared dead in 1951 due to prolonged absence. Marianne frowned. Dead. On paper, mademoiselle. But paper doesn't sing or play the piano in secret. Paper doesn't argue in a locked gallery. Judith lowered her gaze. Her voice was barely a whisper. What if he never left at all? What if he came back, nameless, faceless, to hear from the shadows what had been denied for so long? Poirot folded the letter precisely, as if fitting another piece into his invisible puzzle. That's precisely the theory I'm going to test tonight. At 7 o'clock sharp, Poirot requested that all the residents gather in the hotel's music room. Not for a confrontation, not yet, but for a special evening, as he called it with a measured smile. An attempt, he said, to recreate the oral atmosphere of a forgotten evening. In the center of the room, beneath the chandelier, rested the Steinway piano, pristine, intact, but not silent. Poirot said to Marianne, "Mademoiselle, play the piece you learned from your mother." The same melody that echoed in the China Gallery that night. Marianne hesitated, but agreed. She sat down. She placed her hands delicately on the keyboard, and she began. It was a waltz, slow, with a sadness hidden beneath the harmony. Something in the chord progression spoke of memories that dared not be translated into words. Everyone listened in silence. Even Auguste, who remained in the background, his lips pressed together. Vivienne stood, her fingers interlaced. Judith closed her eyes, as if transported to another winter, a spring that never came. And then, without warning, a discordant note floated from the corridor, an E flat, sharp, pure. It wasn't coming from the living room. It was coming from another piano, one that had supposedly been destroyed. Poirot stood up instantly. "To the gallery," he ordered, already walking. "No one is left behind." They went up the stairs and crossed the hall. The gallery door was ajar. A yellowish light flickered inside. Pushing her, the scene they found was as impossible as it was real. A man, his back turned, was playing the grand piano that had been reinstalled months before after restoration. He didn't turn around. He didn't stop. His fingers flew over the keys with a worn, almost spectral precision. He wore a long coat. His hair, though grey, still had dark streaks. And although his shoulders were narrower than one might expect, his presence filled the room. Poirot stepped forward. "Monsieur Rousseau." The man didn't startle, but the music faded away as if someone had sealed the world in a box. Only then did he turn around. His face was thin, marked by the decades, but he still possessed those same intense eyes from the photograph. There was something tired about his expression, and at the same time, something unforgiving. "I don't have a name anymore," he said simply. "I left it behind years ago. But yes, I was Julian, and I'm here for what was stolen from me." Judith held her breath. Marianne took a step back. Poirot, however, took another step forward. "Have you come for your daughter?" Julian nodded slowly. "For the truth, for the music, for her." He pointed at Marianne. "I heard her play, even before I knew who she was, and I knew that melody. It was ours. I couldn't have learned it if it wasn't in my blood." Judith murmured, "Clarice never wanted you to claim her. She considered you dangerous." Julian smiled, but without warmth. "And yet, here we are. You with your secrets, me with my years hiding among notes and abandoned hotels, all for a daughter, all for a song." Poirot looked at him gravely. "Then you'll understand there are still questions, not about your identity, but about what happened the night of the fire." Julian was silent for a few seconds. "I didn't come to kill. I came to remember. But something went wrong." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Something or someone?" Julian looked down. "Someone heard us, saw us arguing. But what happened next wasn't my doing." Poirot turned to the others. "So, mes amis, the last mask is about to fall, and this time it won't be music that hides it." Chapter 18. The Note That Wasn't Written. The gallery was silent. Julien Rousseau stood by the piano, his shadow projected against the porcelain-covered wall of dry smoke. Poirot watched him with a mixture of compassion and sharpness. His eyes were not those of an accuser, but those of a surgeon who, with the last incision, seeks the exact root of a forgotten illness. Marianne had taken a step back, her mouth half open. Judith couldn't meet her gaze, and Vivian, in the corner, seemed to have understood what was coming before anyone else. Poirot walked slowly to the centre of the room. His shoes made no noise on the polished floor. His voice, however, had the clarity of a clarinet. "We already know the identity of the man who returned from silence," he began. "We also know that Julien didn't light the fire, that he came here to listen, not to destroy. And yet, mes amis, someone did want that night to end in ashes. Someone afraid that the ancient notes would reveal buried truths." Everyone held their breath. Poirot turned to Judith. "You, madame, thought you had buried Julien Rousseau in the past. That silence was enough. But the past doesn't burn away so easily, and melodies, like secrets, return. You said you fell asleep early, that you heard nothing. But when we examined the charred fragments of the vase, we noticed something peculiar. It didn't fall by accident. It was thrown from the end of the gallery, right where you had entered before everyone else." Judith didn't speak. She didn't even blink, but her neck tensed. Poirot continued, without raising his voice. "The key, however, is not what he broke, but what he left intact." He took a small piece of blackened paper out of his pocket. The sheet music. The one where Clarisse had jotted down the last bars of Waltz for an Unknown Daughter. The fragment Marianne hadn't found. It was inside the piano lid, but someone removed it and placed it under the ceramic tile before the fire. The fire destroyed almost everything, except the ink. It was enough for me to read it. He opened the burnt paper. The notes were blurred but still legible. "This measure, madame," he said, looking at Judith, "wasn't written by Clarisse. It was added by another hand, a stiffer one, more restrained. Do you recognize her handwriting?" Judith murmured at last. "I tried to correct it, not erase it." Poirot went a step further. There was a risk that Marianne would hear the full story, that she would understand that her mother had left her more than just a secret. She had left her an inheritance, a name, a past you didn't want her to reclaim. Judith closed her eyes. They wouldn't understand. No one would. I raised Marianne. I protected her. Clarisse asked me before she died to take care of her, to keep her away from him. Julien didn't move. He just looked down. "I wouldn't have claimed her," he said, his voice breaking. "I just wanted to hear her play, to know that something of mine still lived on." Poirot looked at him for a long time, then turned to Vivienne. "And you, Mademoiselle Vivienne, saw something that night. That's why you said the music continued after the fire, because you heard it before the fire started. You knew Julien was there." Vivienne nodded. "I saw her shadow on the porch. I wanted to warn Judith, but something about her face stopped me. I'd never seen her like that, as if the past had materialized in the flesh. And he feared the worst." "Yes," Vivienne whispered. "I hid, I waited, then everything burned." Poirot clasped his hands. But the fire wasn't an accident. It was lit to silence. Not by Julien, not by Vivienne. It was Judith who poured the alcohol on the curtain, not to kill, but to erase, to destroy the scene, the scores, the story, what she couldn't control. Judith, on the verge of tears, raised her face. "I didn't light it," he said in a deep voice. "I just threatened him. I screamed. I broke the vase, but the fire, someone else lit it. When I came back to the living room, it was already burning." A tense silence fell between them. Poirot tilted his head. "So, Who was it? A cough came from down the hall. Auguste, the hotel receptionist, still dressed in his immaculate uniform, walked forward slowly. He didn't seem nervous, just exhausted. "It was me," he said. "I heard the argument. I saw the man come in. I didn't know who he was. I only knew that Judith didn't want me there, for the past to come back. So I waited until they left. And then I lit the fire. I thought that would end it all." Poirot did not seem surprised. "Out of loyalty?" Auguste nodded. "I was raised by family. My mother worked here before me. Whatever Judith asked of me, I did it." Judith, horrified, shook her head. "I never asked you for that." "No," Auguste said sadly. "But sometimes protecting is easier than listening." The authorities were notified. Auguste was arrested without resistance. Judith, although not directly responsible for the fire, had to face the consequences of years of hiding. Julien didn't press charges. He only asked to be allowed to leave. Before doing so, he said goodbye to Marianne with a letter, not a reunion, just a handwritten melody. The waltz. This time, in full. Marianne read it silently. Then she sat down at the gallery's piano, now restored, in the new summer light that peeped through the open windows. And as her fingers danced over the keys for the first time, she didn't think about the broken china or her mother's secrets. He thought about music, in what remains when everything else burns.